When the scriptures are silent on certain issues, we frequently resort to informed speculation to fill in the gaps. This is particularly relevant for subjects like the Nephilim, where not every detail is explicitly stated. However, it's crucial to remember that we cannot simply invent random theories. Any conclusions we draw about biblical matters must be logical and based on what we know from the text. So, how do we proceed? We begin by asking fundamental questions. Are there other parts of the Bible that support our understanding? What does the context of the verses tell us? Can we gain insight from the culture of the time to better understand what the authors were saying? Are there external sources, such as historical or cultural writings, that might provide clues about what the biblical authors knew or what their audience might have understood? Lastly, does the Bible give us enough information to solve the puzzle without having to fabricate details? If the answer to these questions is yes, then we can build a solid foundation. This approach will be essential as we delve into the Book of Enoch and the concept of the Nephilim today. We're exploring a topic that has puzzled believers and scholars for centuries: the Watcher Angels, the Giants, the Nephilim, and their connection to Noah's flood. These stories are briefly mentioned in the canonical books of Genesis and Jude but are significantly expanded in the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that, while not considered part of the standard biblical canon for most Christian traditions, offers a wealth of information about these enigmatic figures. But why does this matter? Because the Book of Enoch provides an alternative perspective on some of the Bible's most mysterious stories, suggesting that the world before Noah was stranger and more complex than we might think. By exploring it, we're not just chasing after strange stories, we're piecing together a larger puzzle that could potentially illuminate the context for some of the most perplexing passages in Genesis. But we need to approach it cautiously, ensuring that any conclusions we draw are grounded in what Scripture supports. Now, let's frame this journey properly. The Book of Enoch introduces us to a group called the Watchers, angels who were tasked with observing humanity but instead chose to interfere, descending to earth and teaching mankind forbidden knowledge. According to Enoch, these watchers sinned greatly, not just by imparting wisdom meant only for the heavenly realm but by taking human wives and fathering a race of giants called the Nephilim. This interaction between divine beings and humans led to widespread corruption on earth and eventually prompted God's judgment through the Great Flood. So, we're not just talking about mythological creatures here, we're exploring a narrative that claims to shape the very foundation of why the flood happened in the first place. And that's where things get really interesting. If these angels truly left their divine posts, what does that tell us about free will in the heavenly realm? Did the Nephilim really exist, and if so, how do they fit into the larger biblical picture? These are the types of questions that can stir up a lot of debate, but they're worth asking because they push us to look deeper at the text and what it's trying to convey. Some might ask, why even bother with a book that isn't part of the traditional Bible? But think about it, just because something isn't in the official canon doesn't mean it isn't valuable. The Book of Enoch was widely read and respected in the early Jewish and Christian communities. In fact, parts of it are quoted directly in the Book of Jude, and the early church fathers referenced it frequently. By studying it, we're gaining insight into how ancient believers might have interpreted the world before the flood and why they thought things got so bad that God had to hit the reset button on humanity. So, throughout this video, we'll be connecting the dots between the Book of Enoch, the Bible, and other ancient texts to paint a clearer picture of the Watcher angels, the Nephilim, and their significance. We'll see how the Nephilim are depicted not just as physical giants but as symbolic of spiritual rebellion, beings that blurred the lines between heaven and earth, light and darkness, order and chaos. They embody a period of time when humanity was exposed to knowledge and power that they weren't ready to handle, which resulted in devastation and judgment. But this isn't just a story about strange beings, it's a cautionary tale about boundaries, what happens when they're crossed, and the consequences that follow. For example, the story of the Watchers isn't just about angels taking human wives, it's about divine beings overstepping their bounds, mixing the sacred with the profane, and corrupting the natural order. Similarly, the Nephilim, who are portrayed as giants, are more than just a race of oversized humans, they represent a mixture of two worlds that were never meant to intertwine. As we unravel this narrative, we're going to keep coming back to one central question: what can we learn from these stories today? Because at the end of the day, every biblical story has a lesson, even the obscure ones. Whether it's about obedience, humility, or the dangers of overreaching for power, these stories have been preserved for a reason. By understanding the tale of the Nephilim and the Watchers in greater depth, we're not just indulging in curiosity, we're unpacking lessons that have shaped the faith and worldview of millions. So, grab your Bible, your Book of Enoch if you have it, and let's dig deep into a story that's equal parts fascinating, mysterious, and yes, a little controversial. We're going to peel back the layers of history, culture, and scripture to see what we can uncover. Because sometimes it's the questions that the Bible doesn't directly answer that end up teaching us the most. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. To truly appreciate the significance of the Book of Enoch and its relationship to the Nephilim, the Watchers, and Noah's flood, we first need to understand where this text comes from and why it matters. The Book of Enoch, or 1 Enoch, is part of a collection of ancient Jewish writings often referred to as apocryphal or pseudepigraphal texts, meaning they were not included in the standard biblical canon. But despite not being in the official Bible for most Christian traditions today, the Book of Enoch holds significant historical and theological value. It provides a fascinating window into how early Jewish communities viewed the spiritual world and the events leading up to the flood. The first key question we need to address is who wrote the Book of Enoch. Traditional belief attributes the authorship to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, whom the Bible describes as someone who walked with God and was taken by God, Genesis 5 verse 24. In Jewish tradition, Enoch is seen as a particularly righteous and holy man, someone who had a special relationship with God. This idea of Enoch being taken by God without dying sets him apart as a figure of great spiritual significance. But the authorship of the book attributed to him is a bit more complex. Scholars generally agree that the Book of Enoch wasn't written by Enoch himself. Instead, it's a collection of writings compiled over centuries, likely between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. These writings were passed down through generations, and many of them were based on oral traditions that had been circulating long before they were put to paper. This doesn't make the content any less valuable, it simply means that we're dealing with a text that reflects the thoughts, beliefs, and concerns of multiple generations of Jewish people living in very different historical contexts. The Book of Enoch was likely written during what's known as the Second Temple period, a time of great religious and cultural upheaval in Jewish history. After the Jews returned from exile in Babylon and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, they faced new challenges: foreign rulers, religious division, and the growing influence of Hellenistic Greek culture. During this period, many Jewish writers were grappling with big questions about God's justice, the problem of evil, and the nature of the spiritual realm. The Book of Enoch can be seen as part of this broader movement to explore and explain these theological mysteries. One of the most important things to understand about the Book of Enoch is that it wasn't always considered fringe literature. In fact, it was highly regarded by many Jewish groups, especially the Essenes, who were a Jewish sect that lived around the time of Jesus. The Essenes are best known today for their connection to the Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of ancient Jewish texts discovered in the 20th century. Many of these scrolls contain passages from the Book of Enoch, showing just how widespread and influential this text was in certain Jewish communities. Interestingly, early Christians were also familiar with the Book of Enoch. Some of the Church Fathers, such as Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, referenced it in their writings. Even the New Testament makes a direct reference to Enoch in the book of Jude, verse 14, which is almost a direct quotation from the Book of Enoch. This shows that at least some early Christians considered it authoritative. So, why, if the Book of Enoch was so influential, did it eventually fall out of favor? The answer lies in the process of canonization. When Jewish and Christian leaders were deciding which books should be included in the official canon of Scripture, the Book of Enoch was left out, possibly because of its highly symbolic and mystical content. For many early Christian theologians, especially after the rise of the Roman Church, the text may have seemed too speculative or fantastical, dealing with spiritual realities that weren't as central to the core message of salvation through Christ. But despite not making it into the official canon, the Book of Enoch didn't disappear. It continued to circulate among various Christian groups. Especially in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where it is still considered part of the Bible today. The Ethiopian Church preserved and copied the text, which is why we still have full versions of it available. This makes Ethiopia a key part of the story when we talk about the preservation of ancient Christian writings, especially those that were not included in the mainstream biblical canon. Now, let's talk a bit about the structure of the Book of Enoch itself. It's actually not just one book but a compilation of several different sections, each of which deals with a different set of themes. The most famous part of the Book of Enoch, and the one most relevant to our discussion of the Nephilim and the Watchers, is called the Book of the Watchers. This section, which forms the first 36 chapters of 1 Enoch, contains the story of the angels who descended to earth, took human wives, and fathered the Nephilim. It's this section that provides the most detailed account of the events leading up to Noah's flood and offers a deeper look into the spiritual and cosmic forces at play during that time. Another important section of the Book of Enoch is the Book of Parables, which focuses more on the judgment of the wicked and the reward of the righteous. This section has a more apocalyptic tone and deals with the final judgment, the coming of the Messiah, and the ultimate fate of the Watchers. What's fascinating about the Book of Parables is that it offers a messianic vision that predates the New Testament by several centuries, showing that the expectation of a messianic figure was alive and well in Jewish thought long before Jesus appeared on the scene. The third major section of the Book of Enoch is called the Astronomical Book or the Book of Heavenly Luminaries, which deals with Enoch's visions of the cosmos. This section is particularly concerned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars and how they reflect the order of God's creation. In many ways, it can be seen as a precursor to later Jewish and Christian writings about the heavenly realms, angels, and the structure of the universe. So, we have a collection of writings that touch on everything from angels and giants to cosmic order and final judgment. But what's really important to remember is that the Book of Enoch isn't just a work of speculative fiction. It reflects real concerns and theological questions that Jewish communities were wrestling with during a time of profound change and uncertainty. The figure of Enoch as a righteous man who walked with God provided a model of spiritual purity and closeness to the divine that many Jews and early Christians aspired to. It's worth noting that the themes explored in the Book of Enoch, especially the corruption of the Watchers and the rise of the Nephilim, are echoed in other ancient texts as well. For instance, the Genesis Apocryphon, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, also includes references to fallen angels and giants. This indicates that the story of the Watchers was not exclusive to the Book of Enoch, but was part of a broader narrative that was circulating in Jewish communities during this period. As we proceed in this video, we'll delve deeper into the specific stories found in the Book of Enoch, starting with the Watchers and their fall from grace. But first, we needed this foundational understanding of the book's origins to truly appreciate the impact it has had on the way we understand the spiritual realm. Now, let's discuss the Watchers. These beings play a pivotal role in the events leading up to the Great Flood, and their actions are at the heart of some of the most complex theological questions in ancient Judaism. But who exactly were the Watchers? Why were they on earth in the first place, and how did their rebellion lead to the downfall of not only themselves but also of humanity? Let's start with the basics. The term Watcher comes from the Hebrew word iron, which means those who are awake or those who watch. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are described as a group of angels sent to observe humanity. Their role was to be guardians or overseers of the human race, but they were not meant to interfere directly in the lives of humans. This concept of angels acting as divine messengers and watchers is not unique to Enoch. Throughout the Bible, we see angels performing similar roles. But what sets the Watchers of Enoch apart is what they did after they were sent to earth. According to the Book of Enoch, a group of 200 Watchers descended from heaven to earth during the time of Jared, one of Enoch's ancestors. This event is described in great detail in 1 Enoch 6:8, and it marks the beginning of a series of catastrophic events that would ultimately lead to the Great Flood. The leader of this group was an angel named Shemahazah, sometimes spelled Samiaza, and under his leadership, the Watchers made a fateful decision. They decided to abandon their heavenly posts and take human wives for themselves. This act of disobedience was a direct violation of the divine order. In Genesis, angels are portrayed as being distinct from humans. They belong to a different realm, one that operates under a different set of rules. The Watchers, however, crossed that boundary by taking human wives. They not only defied God's will but also introduced something unnatural into the world. The result of their union with human women was the birth of the Nephilim, a race of giants who were said to be mighty, violent, and corrupt. But before we dive deeper into the consequences of the Watchers' actions, let's take a moment to explore their motivations. Why did these angels, who were sent to watch over humanity, decide to abandon their divine roles and engage in such a forbidden act? According to the text, the Watchers were drawn to the beauty of human women. 1 Enoch 6:2 states, "The sons of heaven saw and lusted after them and said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men and let us beget children." This lust, however, wasn't just a fleeting temptation, it was an active rebellion against the divine order established by God. The rebellion of the Watchers can be seen as a parallel to the story of Satan's fall from grace. Like Lucifer, who desired power and autonomy outside of God's authority, the Watchers desired to break free from their designated roles and indulge in their own desires. But their rebellion wasn't just a matter of personal sin. It had far-reaching consequences for the entire world. By crossing the boundaries between the divine and the human, the Watchers introduced chaos into the created order. One of the most striking aspects of the Watchers' rebellion is the knowledge they imparted to humanity. In 1 Enoch 8, we read that the Watchers taught humans a variety of forbidden arts and sciences. These included the use of metal for weapons, the practice of enchantments and witchcraft, the study of astrology, and the knowledge of plants and herbs used for seduction and beauty enhancement. In other words, the Watchers didn't just corrupt humanity through their offspring, the Nephilim, they also corrupted human knowledge. This theme of forbidden knowledge is something we see echoed throughout the Bible. In the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In both cases, the acquisition of knowledge leads to the downfall of humanity. The Watchers, like the serpent, introduced knowledge that humanity was not ready for. What's particularly interesting here is that the knowledge itself wasn't necessarily evil. Metalworking and astronomy, for example, can be useful and even beneficial. But in the context of the Watchers' rebellion, this knowledge was corrupted, leading to violence, pride, and idolatry. The Nephilim, the children of the Watchers and human women, are described as being giants both in physical stature and in their capacity for evil. 1 Enoch 7:2 describes them as giants whose height was 300 cubits, that's about 450 feet tall, though many scholars believe this number is symbolic, representing their overwhelming power and influence rather than their literal height. The Nephilim are said to have caused great destruction on earth. They consumed vast amounts of food, leading to famine, and they turned to violence, devouring mankind. They even began to eat the flesh of animals and drink blood, which, according to Jewish law, was strictly forbidden. The Watchers, now fully aware of the destruction they had caused, realized their grave mistake. 1 Enoch 13 tells us that the Watchers pleaded with Enoch to intercede on their behalf. Enoch, who was known for his close relationship with God, agreed to bring their petitions before the Lord. But God's judgment was swift and severe. In 1 Enoch 10, God instructs the archangels Michael, Raphael, and Gabriel to deal with the Watchers and their offspring. Michael is told to bind Shemhaza and the other Watchers and cast them into the depths of the earth until the day of judgment. As for the Nephilim, they were to be destroyed in the flood that was soon to come. The destruction of the Nephilim and the binding of the Watchers serve as a powerful reminder of the consequences of defying God's order. It wasn't just the Watchers who were punished, their actions had ripple effects throughout all of creation. The violence and corruption introduced by the Nephilim spread to all of humanity, which is why God ultimately decided to send the flood and start over with Noah and his family. Now, you might be wondering why the Bible only briefly mentions the Watchers and the Nephilim in Genesis. while the Book of Enoch goes into such great detail. One reason could be that the writers of Genesis were more focused on the broader narrative of humanity's fall and redemption, while the Book of Enoch zooms in on the spiritual and cosmic dimensions of that story. The brief mention of the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis 6 verse 4 could be seen as a shorthand reference to a much larger and more complicated story that was later expanded upon in other Jewish writings, including Enoch. In this way, the Watchers serve as a kind of cautionary tale. Their fall from grace reminds us of the importance of obedience to God and the dangers of crossing boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. The Watchers were angels, beings who had been entrusted with a great responsibility. But instead of fulfilling their divine mission, they allowed their desires to lead them astray. The consequences of their actions were catastrophic, not only for themselves but for the entire human race. But the story of the Watchers also raises some intriguing theological questions. For example, what does it mean for angels to have free will? In many Christian traditions, angels are seen as obedient servants of God who lack the ability to rebel. Yet the Watchers clearly made a choice to leave their posts, take human wives, and impart forbidden knowledge to humanity. This suggests that angels, like humans, have the capacity for both good and evil. It also raises the question of why God allowed the Watchers to rebel in the first place. Was it part of a larger plan, or was it simply the result of the same free will that leads humans to sin? Another question that arises is the nature of the Nephilim. Were they merely the product of angelic and human union, or do they represent something deeper? Some scholars have suggested that the Nephilim symbolize a kind of spiritual corruption, a blending of two realms that were never meant to mix. In this view, the Nephilim aren't just physical giants but spiritual beings who embody the chaos and disorder that comes when the divine and human worlds are improperly joined. This interpretation fits with the larger biblical theme of the importance of boundaries, whether it's the boundary between light and darkness in Genesis 1 or the boundary between the holy and the profane in the Levitical laws. The Nephilim and giants. First, let's address the term Nephilim itself. The word comes from the Hebrew root NPL, meaning to fall or fallen ones. This definition immediately evokes an image of beings who are in some way fallen from grace, whether that means literally being descended from the fallen Watcher angels or figuratively as symbols of humanity's descent into sin. In Genesis 6 verse 4, the Nephilim are described as being on the earth in the days before the flood, and they are characterized as mighty men of old, men of renown. But this brief mention in the Bible leaves us with more questions than answers. Who were these mighty men? Why were they considered so important, and what was the nature of their relationship with humanity? To answer these questions, we need to dive into the expanded account provided in the Book of Enoch. According to Enoch, the Nephilim were the direct offspring of the Watcher angels who, in defiance of God's will, took human wives. The union between angels and humans produced these hybrid beings who were not only physically imposing, described as giants, but also deeply corrupt in both their actions and their nature. Their birth is portrayed as a violation of the divine order, a mixing of the heavenly and earthly realms that was never meant to happen. The result was a race of beings who became notorious for their violence, greed, and insatiable appetites. 1 Enoch 7:3-4 paints a vivid picture of the Nephilim's behavior. They, the Nephilim, consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, The giants turned against them and devoured mankind. They began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. This passage suggests that the Nephilim weren't just giants in size, they were giants in evil. Their presence on earth led to widespread violence and chaos, contributing to the moral decay that eventually brought about God's judgment through the flood. This notion of the Nephilim as destructive giants is echoed in other ancient texts, including some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. For instance, the Genesis Apocryphon, one of the scrolls discovered at Qumran, also refers to the Nephilim and their actions, linking them to the period of extreme corruption before the flood. These scrolls help us understand that the story of the Nephilim was not just a fringe belief, it was part of a larger, deeply embedded tradition within ancient Jewish thought, one that held the Nephilim responsible for much of the world's pre-flood wickedness. So, what exactly made the Nephilim so dangerous? According to the Book of Enoch and other sources, it wasn't just their size or physical strength, although those certainly played a role. More importantly, it was their spiritual corruption and their tendency to spread violence and immorality wherever they went. The Nephilim are depicted as beings who are out of control, driven by unnatural appetites that lead them to destroy everything in their path. Their very existence is an affront to the natural order established by God, and their actions accelerate the spread of evil throughout the human race. It's important to note that the Nephilim were not just isolated to a single moment in history. There is evidence in the Bible and other ancient texts that suggest that giants or beings similar to the Nephilim continued to exist even after the flood. This idea is controversial and has been the subject of much debate among theologians and scholars. For example, Numbers 13:33 mentions the sons of Anak, a group of giants encountered by the Israelites during their exploration of Canaan. The spies who scouted the land reported back saying, "We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them." This description of the Anakim as towering giants, much like the Nephilim, raises the possibility that the giants of the pre-flood world somehow survived or that a similar race of beings emerged after the flood. Another example comes from Deuteronomy 2 verses 10 to 11, where we read about the Emim, another race of giants who inhabited the land of Moab. The Emim are described as a fearsome and mighty people, much like the Nephilim of old. In fact, the Bible frequently mentions various groups of giants, such as the Emim, the Zamzummim, and the Anakim, who lived in the region during the time of the Israelite conquest. While these giants are not always directly linked to the Nephilim, the similarities in their description suggest that they share a common origin, possibly as descendants of the same fallen angels who fathered the Nephilim. This leads us to a crucial theological question: if the Nephilim were wiped out in the flood, how could giants still exist after Noah's time? There are several theories that attempt to explain this. One possibility is that the Watcher angels returned to earth after the flood and once again took human wives, resulting in a new generation of giants. This theory, while speculative, is supported by some interpretations of the Book of Enoch, which suggests that the Watcher's influence did not entirely disappear after the flood. Another theory is that the Nephilim were not completely destroyed by the flood. Some may have survived either through supernatural means or by finding refuge in hidden places. Alternatively, it could be that the post-flood giants were not direct descendants of the Watchers but were instead a separate group of people who had similar traits or characteristics. Whatever the case may be, the Bible makes it clear that these giants posed a significant threat to God's people. Throughout the Old Testament, we see the Israelites repeatedly coming into conflict with these giant clans. One of the most famous examples is the story of Goliath, the giant Philistine warrior who challenged the Israelite army in 1 Samuel 17. Goliath is described as being over 9 feet tall, and his physical prowess was so intimidating that no one in the Israelite army dared to face him until David stepped forward with nothing but a slingshot and his faith in God. David's defeat of Goliath is one of the most iconic stories in the Bible, and it serves as a powerful reminder that even the mightiest giants are no match for God's power. But beyond the physical battles, the story of the Nephilim and the giants represents a deeper spiritual struggle. The giants are not just opponents of Israel, they are symbols of the chaotic forces that stand in opposition to God's plan for humanity. In a sense, the Nephilim embody everything that is wrong with the pre-flood world: rebellion, violence, and the mixing of the divine and human realms. Their presence is a constant reminder of the consequence of sin and the dangers of going against God's established order. Now, let's talk about Noah's flood and the Nephilim. Noah's flood is one of the most significant events in the Bible, representing both a moment of divine judgment and a fresh start for humanity. While most people are familiar with the basic outline of the story, Noah, his family, and a pair of each animal being saved from the waters, there's much more to the flood narrative than just survival. The flood is a direct response to the rampant corruption and violence that had consumed the earth. Much of which, according to the Book of Enoch, was caused by the Nephilim and the Watcher Angels. To understand the connection between the Nephilim and the flood, we need to go back to Genesis 6 verse 4, where the brief but crucial reference to the sons of God and the Nephilim appears. This passage tells us that the sons of God, interpreted in the Book of Enoch as the Watcher Angels, took human wives and had children by them, creating the Nephilim. As we've already explored, the Nephilim were giants who brought widespread violence and chaos to the earth. The Bible continues in Genesis 6 verses 5 to 7, saying, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created." This passage sets the stage for the flood, making it clear that God's judgment was a response to the overwhelming evil that had taken hold of humanity. The text emphasizes the pervasive nature of this wickedness, stating that every thought of the human heart was evil all the time. While the Bible doesn't go into much detail about how the Nephilim contributed to this state of affairs, the Book of Enoch provides a much more in-depth account of their role in corrupting both humanity and the natural world. As we saw in the previous narrative, the Nephilim were not only violent and destructive, but they also introduced forbidden knowledge and practices that led to further moral decay. The Watcher Angels, who fathered the Nephilim, taught humans the use of weapons, sorcery, and various other forms of technology that were meant to be kept secret. The result was an earth filled with violence, idolatry, and rebellion against God's laws. According to 1 Enoch 9, the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel saw the destruction caused by the Watchers and their offspring and cried out to God, asking him to intervene. In response, God declared his intention to send a flood to cleanse the earth of this corruption. In 1 Enoch 10, God commands the archangel Uriel to warn Noah of the coming deluge, instructing him to build an ark that would save him and his family. This mirrors the account in Genesis, where God speaks directly to Noah, instructing him to build an ark and gather the animals. However, the Book of Enoch adds an additional layer to the story, explaining that the flood was not just a punishment for humanity's sin but specifically for the actions of the Watchers and the Nephilim. God's judgment is described as twofold. The Watcher angels are to be bound and cast into the abyss, where they will await final judgment, and the Nephilim are to be destroyed in the waters of the flood. One of the most striking aspects of the flood narrative in both Genesis and Enoch is the way it highlights the theme of divine justice. The flood is not just a random act of destruction, it is a carefully measured response to the profound corruption that had taken hold of the earth. In Genesis 6 verse 9, Noah is described as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. This righteousness sets him apart from the rest of humanity, making him the one person God chooses to save from the coming judgment. Noah's righteousness is contrasted with the violence and evil of the Nephilim and the rest of humanity, reinforcing the idea that God's judgment is based on moral character and behavior. In the Book of Enoch, this theme of divine justice is even more pronounced. The Watcher angels, who were once trusted with the care of humanity, are held accountable for their rebellion and the chaos they unleashed. 1 Enoch 10-1-13 describes how the archangels are instructed to imprison the Watchers in the depths of the earth, bind them for 70 generations underneath the rocks of the ground, until the day of their judgment and their consummation, until the eternal judgment is consummated. In those days, they will be led off to the abyss of fire. The Nephilim, meanwhile, are destroyed by the flood, their giant bodies washed away in the deluge. This act of divine justice serves as a warning to both humans and angels alike: no one is above God's law, and those who defy it will face the consequences. But the story of the flood is not just about judgment, it is also about renewal and hope. After the waters recede, Noah and his family are given the opportunity to start over, to rebuild a world free from the corruption that had plagued the pre-flood earth. In Genesis 9, God makes a covenant with Noah, promising never to destroy the earth by flood again and giving Noah and his descendants the task of repopulating the earth. The rainbow is given as a sign of this covenant, a symbol of God's promise to preserve and protect humanity. This moment of renewal is also present in the Book of Enoch, although the focus there is more on the cosmic significance of the flood. In 1 Enoch 65-67, we read about the new world that emerges after the flood, a world in which the influence of the Watchers and the Nephilim has been removed, allowing humanity to flourish once again. The flood is portrayed as a kind of cosmic reset, a purification of the earth that restores the natural order and allows for a fresh start. The text also emphasizes the role of Noah as a righteous leader who, through his obedience to God, is able to save not only his family but the entire human race. One of the most important aspects of the flood narrative, both in the Bible and in the Book of Enoch, is the idea that the world before the flood was fundamentally different from the world that came after. In the pre-flood world, humanity lived in close proximity to angels, and the boundaries between the human and divine realms were more fluid. The presence of the Watchers and the Nephilim blurred these lines even further, creating a world in which the natural and supernatural were deeply intertwined. The flood, in a sense, serves to re-establish the boundaries between heaven and earth, separating the human and divine realms once more, and ensuring that such a rebellion cannot happen again. This idea of the flood as a boundary-setting event is reflected in the post-flood laws that God gives to Noah and his descendants. In Genesis 9 verses 4 to 6, for example, God specifically commands Noah and his family not to eat meat with its lifeblood still in it, a rule that reflects the importance of maintaining the distinction between life and death. God also establishes the principle of human justice, declaring that whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. These laws serve to reinforce the idea that the post-flood world is governed by a new set of rules, ones that are designed to maintain order and prevent the kind of widespread corruption that led to the flood in the first place. As we reflect on the story of Noah's flood and its connection to the Nephilim, it's important to consider what this narrative teaches us about the nature of divine judgment and mercy. On the one hand, the flood is a powerful reminder that God takes sin seriously. The corruption of the pre-flood world was so severe that it required a complete reset. Nothing short of a global catastrophe could cleanse the earth of the evil that had taken root. But at the same time, the flood is also a testament to God's mercy. Despite the overwhelming wickedness of humanity, God chose to spare Noah and his family, giving them the opportunity to start over. This balance between judgment and mercy is a theme that runs throughout the Bible. And it's one that is particularly evident in the story of the flood. Another key takeaway from the flood narrative is the importance of obedience and faith. Noah's willingness to follow God's instructions, even when they seemed impossible or irrational, is what ultimately saved him and his family. In a world consumed by violence and sin, Noah stood out as a beacon of righteousness, someone who was willing to trust in God's plan, even when it didn't make sense. This theme of obedience is echoed in the New Testament, where Noah is held up as an example of faith. In Hebrews 11 verse 7, we read, "By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith." The story of Noah and the flood also serves as a warning about the consequences of unchecked evil. The corruption that led to the flood didn't happen overnight, it was the result of a long process of rebellion and moral decay, much of which was fueled by the influence of the Watchers and the Nephilim. This gradual descent into chaos is something that we can see reflected in our own world today. When sin goes unchecked, when boundaries are crossed without consequence, the result is often destruction, whether that's on a personal, societal, or even global level. The Watcher Angels, the Nephilim, the flood, each piece of this puzzle pushes us to consider our place in the universe, our responsibilities, and the lines we should never cross, so let's take this seriously. The world may look different now, but the core battle remains, the struggle between order and chaos, truth and deception, righteousness and rebellion. And here's the truth, each one of us is part of that struggle. What decisions will we make? How will we choose to live in a world that constantly challenges the boundaries set by God? Now, if you've made it this far, you're not just here for curiosity, you're seeking something deeper. So I challenge you, don't let this moment slip by. Take what you've learned and apply it to your life. Stand firm in your values, seek truth, and live with intention. And if you're ready to go deeper into these incredible, mind-blowing topics, hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications so you never miss a video, as we continue unraveling these ancient mysteries together. Share this with friends, with family, with anyone who's seeking more. Let's build a community that's hungry for knowledge, truth, and a life of purpose. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to explore more with you. Stay curious, stay focused, and most importantly, stay true to your calling.